Welcome to the Prelude Talks. This week we have David Cotterrell. In previous weeks we've had Kate Goodwin, Head of Architecture at the Royal Academy of Arts. We've had myself, we've had Sir Michael Marmot, whose video will be online at the end of this week. Future talks include Felicity Callard, who is the Professor of Social Research and Director at the Birkbeck Institute. She's here tomorrow, and then next week the last one in the series is Alice Thwaite, who runs an organisation that look at improving older people's lives through creativity. And each of those speakers is very different in their area of expertise and in their background. So what we've been doing with this series of bespoke talks is producing really an online archive that's building towards these 2 days on the 2nd and 3rd of March, this 2-day symposium. That is a presentation of scientific and creative investigation into the determinants of a healthy brain. So each speaker is an ambassador from a very diverse discipline. They're indicating the territory of Headspace 2018, which has two ambitions. It wants to approach complex issues with innovation, and it's seeking knowledge from a diversity of expertise to bring fresh insight, really, to enduring challenges. So the question really is what connects them, and what we believe connects them is that in their own practice each speaker is examining the relationship between information gathering, decision making and delivery. They operate across systems of knowledge and understanding, and they're often wrestling with how knowledge is articulated or formed, how powers engage with, and how systemic bias is countered. We asked them to talk at the edge of their comfort zone. So everybody's gone a little bit further than they normally would be comfortable doing. And at the very edge of what they know. So they've made for an interesting series as they're building. So David Cotterrell is an installation artist working across media and technologies to explore the social and political tendencies of a world that's at once shared and divided. He's also research professor in fine art at the Faculty of Arts, Computing, Engineering and Science at Sheffield Hallam University. And his work has been commissioned and shown extensively across Europe. I first came across David because he was a war artist for during the Afghan war. And also we've had long conversations both about being a war artist in contemporary world and also about master planning, which is another of his interests. So like many of the speakers in this series, David's work is sitting at the edge of territory that's articulated at an intersectional space, at a place on the edge of things. And that's what we asked him to talk about. We asked him to talk about the limits of empathy. David Cotterrell.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. It's a bit humbling, really, when I got a message from Dominic saying, would you talk about empathy in the context of looking at possibly kind of mental health and a whole range of other issues, which I know that this series is leading up to a conference I felt particularly underqualified. But I am interested in empathy. I'm going to talk about my practice as an artist, trying not to get too swallowed up in the specifics about projects. And I'm trying to hope that there'll be an allegory visible from the context I'm talking about to maybe a wider structural problem to do with the way we perceive problems and the way policy addresses individual experience. So I'm going to start with a clip, and with a bit of luck, if my timing works out, we'll return to make sense of this at the end.
Don't look now, someone's staring at you. Oh, one of my students? Do you think they recognize you? Of course they recognize me. They'll recognize me anywhere, in any situation. And here, dressed like this, of course they'll recognize me. And want to talk to me. Is he coming over? It's a she. Is she coming over? How do I look? No, she's not coming over. Is she smiling? Should I turn and smile at her? She's not smiling. Describe her expression. Well, she's sort of, tell me the truth. Curious, sort of, and sad. Well, as long as it's not. And sorry for you, sort of. Do you think they all feel sorry for me? Depends what they've heard. Well, that's really difficult, isn't it? If they all feel sorry for me. What's to feel sorry for? You're here for an operation. A pro at operations. Such a pro at operations. I could teach them something. Still, you could teach them something very important. From this perspective. Yes, perspective they don't have. Yet. Very important. I could teach them something very important about operations, about perspectives. Does everyone here know me? I don't know. I can never tell anymore if they know me. People forget fast. Well, there's a lot to remember. That's it. That's it precisely. Oh gosh. What? I operated on her. Who, her? Yeah. Oh, you sure? Sure, I'm sure. You're making a mistake. I never make mistakes. Listen to yourself. Just stop for a bit and look at yourself.
When I was 16, I worked as a switchboard operator for 3 months in the summer between my GCSEs and my A-levels, and at the end of it I bought my first camera, and it was a Pentax Super A, which I don't know if anyone's ever seen one of those, but it was a basic film camera, and I got it second-hand with a 50mm lens. And it was incredibly exciting. I bought black and white film, and I cycled around Lancashire with this camera and took pictures of things that I thought might look good on black and white film. And I had to cycle some distance sometimes to get back from the object I wanted to photograph so I could get the whole thing in frame. And I started realizing I was seeing the landscape more in terms of light and shade than color, because I was starting to perceive things that fitted with the lens. It was about 4 years later before I could afford a wide-angle lens, but eventually I got myself a fisheye lens. And the incredible thing is that when you put that on, 50mm lens, I don't know if anybody is familiar with this because we take photos with cameras rather than cameras now, but a 50mm lens is meant to be no distortion. Essentially, it's the way we see. So the perspective the camera sees is similar to the perspective we see with our eyes. You put a fisheye lens on, and it's seeing slightly more than we can see. It's distorting the image, but it also kind of encompasses the range of information we get when we are in a room like this, because our eyes are roving. We're constantly picking out focus, and we're building an aggregate image using all of our ability to try and splice together bits of detail with general views and other things. So that the fisheye view encapsulates everything. It sees everything right away from my peripheral vision through to the middle. And once you've had that, it's really hard actually to take the fisheye lens off and put the standard one back on. As soon as you do that, you have this sense of loss. You're missing the peripheral vision, you're having to edit out something which you might find was important to the moment, and you're having to accept that the figure on the horizon probably won't be visible if I'm taking a picture of the figure over here. But we know that the fisheye lens isn't what we experience. It isn't really representative visually of the experience, but still we have this difficulty. Once we've been able to step back that far, how do we decide to step back in and ignore the context around it? So I was kind of taken a little bit by a line that Dominic said in one of the previous videos. I think it was the end of Kate's talk, which saying that this was about brains in bodies and bodies in buildings and buildings within bigger spaces, and those bigger spaces within systems of thinking and behaving. And I've realized essentially that kind of really resonated. I realized that essentially my practice has always been about trying to work out how we can kind of reconcile ourselves with this first-person view trapped within a structure or an abstraction which is bigger than what we can actually experience ourselves. The systems, the ways of thinking and behaving, the things which frame our view, and how it is that you can decide to represent one or other of these perspectives and possibly prioritize that over the other. So I'm now going to try and race through a series of rather eclectic projects to try and explain my attempt to do this. So it begins, I'm going to be mainly talking about architecture and master planning, ironically. So although I did a painting degree, I'm kind of skipping that part. You're going to be saved some of the more embarrassing attempts at painting. I'm going straight to the point where I lost my faith and started trying to make interventions in the real world outside of the studio. I was trying to find a way as an artist in which you can explain the things which appear to be vitally important to you, but which maybe are not represented that way by the conventional narratives around you. I'd been interested by this book, The Social Contract by Rousseau, which offered a really interesting kind of conceit, the idea that possibly the world had been changed fundamentally by a few significant events deep in history. There was an idea that one of the first great crimes against humanity was somebody enclosing a piece of land. And one of the second great failings of humanity was the acceptance of that as a legitimate act. This is loosely paraphrased. They seem to think that a lot of the world's greed and avarice and fear and the paranoia of losing something which you claim as your own all came from something alongside that moment. Whether it's about kind of defining something as being owned and something as being shared, or whether it's defining the limit of your own responsibility in the world. So when I decided I was going to try and reintroduce myself to people around me as an artist who didn't paint, because they still expected me to be doing figurative portrait paintings, I thought I'd make my own property and just see if I was able to test to see how plausible you could make this assumption. So I built a property that could fit inside a 340 Volvo. It folded flat and it had a buoyancy device and an anchor, and you can install it in seconds anywhere you wanted. So I drove up about midnight on a Sunday night and I pushed it into the river somewhere in Hampshire between two rivers with a for sale sign on it. And in the morning, in all the local papers, this advert went out. For sale or lease, desirable bijou property, elegant Winchester location, all-round views of water. It was my number on the sign there, and my number in the advert. And so people could ring up, and I persuaded my housemates not to answer the phone, and the answer phone kind of gave instructions on how to leave a bid in a silent auction or how to view the property. And then I went along, kind of hid in the bushes and tried to take pictures of people just to prove that they believed it. Nobody bought it. And if they had, I didn't really own the river anyway, but it was ambiguous who did. I found out later that you can own a river if you own both the banks. You own the water as it flows through, and then it becomes somebody else's as soon as it passes. But the idea of actually being able to sell something which was entirely transient, and possibly what's more important is maybe make people believe that you could do that, seemed to be the most important thing. I was interested in property because I grew up in suburban East London. It was kind of an area where I think my house, it wasn't this one, but it was one identical to it, was one of about 20,000 built in 1 year. They were all built identically for the tube expansion, kind of late 1910s, kind of 1919 or so. They were all standard C-class houses. And while I thought my house was deeply distinctive because I lived there my whole childhood and I recognise it clearly from the whole street, other people that came to visit from Lancashire and other places would sometimes get lost, because to them they all look the same. And of course it became clear that while I saw the idiosyncrasies and the powerful attempts by individuals to stamp their mark on this little territory to claim it for themselves, for other people they were seeing not the individual but actually the structure around it, the thing which had made it happen. I thought my house was special, and I was interested, I suppose, that I grew up in a landscape which didn't have a great history but was entirely defined by designers, by master planners, by politicians and by architects. It didn't evolve, it was just created. And as a child I didn't really think of that, but when I left home and looked back, I realised of course there was somebody that somewhere had made a decision to define my world and the parameters of my perspective. And that became profoundly important. I had a chance to, when I left college, I'd left doing things like floating fences in rivers and making steam trains appear on gas and things like that, and I was clearly unemployable. And there was no way I could sell anything because I didn't make objects anymore, and most of the things I made involved borrowed equipment and had to be dismantled at the end. So I got myself a job as a librarian, and I worked as a lighting designer and various other things, thinking I would subsidise my practice forever. But strangely, a few architects kind of noticed that this kind of work was happening and took a chance on me and allowed me to get involved in some kind of temporary public art projects where what I realised was that I was being involved in something bigger than myself. I got involved in paper macheing houses and making geysers erupt and kind of other ways in which I felt I was making a small political statement in a landscape that had been overlooked, often in places that had suffered massive industrial decline and were impoverished and had a reason for people to think it might be worth investing in these places and thinking again. And artists are often deployed in that way, sometimes to open up conversations and break the ice, and sometimes to help people kind of feel that they're being celebrated, and other times, occasionally, to raise questions to ask of government. I got involved in all these things, but I realised that gradually, from my perspective, I wasn't really aware of what major project I was complicit within. I was being allowed access to these landscapes, and I was able to intervene. And some artists might be involved in making monuments to the roundabout that's been created. Others be there kind of trying to produce graffiti which would annoy the local council. But either way, you're part of a bigger plan. The fact it's tolerated, or the fact that you're invited, means that there's a bigger narrative is happening. And I realized that there was a European Regeneration Board grant which was being focused on the whole area where I made my first project. And of course I wasn't able to see the parameters of that, understand whether that was going to produce a good outcome or a bad one. I just happened to be somewhere on the ground making a small artwork and then walking away. So in parallel with a kind of eclectic practice of making temporary works and sometimes making objects, but never anything which was viable in terms of sales, I found there was an opportunity to actually get access to one of these master planning processes, one of these government processes that produce the document that allows the artworks to exist, that possibly defines the shape of the houses that are going to be built and decides whether there's going to be a roundabout or a pedestrian crossing or whether there's going to be a park in a landscape that the rest of us and all of us will end up using. There was a master plan, a 35-year plan being made for a part of Britain. It was one of 4 growth areas. This was for Ashford, which was the smallest, and it was given this kind of focus because the Eurotunnel was about to come up and it was going to land in Ashford. And so Ashford, a rather average town in Kent, suddenly became a focus of activity. But it was also a great experiment to find out how you can plan for 35 years in such a way that it doesn't cause a damaging precedent, because there were larger areas coming up, like the Thames Gateway. They started the first draft of the plan and they hadn't really mentioned culture, and they talked about housing and education and commerce and infrastructure and transport. But the Arts Council panicked and thought, you can't write a 35-year plan, something for more than a generation, and not mention anything to do with culture. And they persuaded them to let an artist come in. So I came in, I got a suit, and I kind of joined a table like this, surrounded by people that were used to this kind of environment, of people from government agencies and architects and planners and people that are very professional. And they thought I was there to paint their portraits. And I realized actually that would be not very helpful to the process. They thought maybe I'd make a public artwork for the roundabout or the structure they were going to build, but I didn't feel confident that I agreed with the choices they were going to make yet, because I didn't understand the process. So I sat with them and I tried to learn some of the acronyms and got involved and tried to understand whether I really trusted that it was possible to comprehend a landscape 35 years hence, and whether their decisions were things that I felt comfortable aligning myself with. We ended up writing that 35-year plan. I wrote a chapter on culture, and that became part of the policy. But most of the people, probably including myself, will never witness whether that was a success or not, or whether actually it was a naive aspiration. To be senior enough to write a 35-year plan, a master planner, not the artist, because I was a fairly junior person, you're probably at the top of your career. So you're probably kind of like 50s or older. You're probably going to retire before the plan is completed. There's a good chance that the landscape, the society which will occupy that landscape you're creating, will live in a completely unimaginable world from the one that you've grown up in. For me, obviously, kind of 20 years ago, I wasn't really aware of the internet. I was kind of quite happy without a mobile phone, and I kind of 25 years ago or 30 years ago, there were no cash points. It's not easy for me to imagine that 35 years time from now, the landscape will probably be quite different from what I picture it to be. And I was kind of entranced and seduced by the idea that anybody could look at this landscape from above and feel that they had the confidence to understand it from that kind of geometry. We sat around in a big building in the center of town, and people would drive in, or they would possibly get the train, but most people were driving. And we would look at these maps and try and ignore the ring road that we used to get in there, to that building. You'd be mindful of the failures of the infrastructure outside and of the kind of the problems with the landscape that you were probably going to affect. But you'd be looking at it like this. And for me, it's seductive. In fact, what I was going to call this talk, if I put a title up, was probably Empathy, or the Seduction of Abstraction. There's a privilege to viewing a large amount of data at once. It's the wide-angle lens. It's also the reason why we feel a bit heroic if we climb a hill and look back at a landscape. It's a kind of reason why people like going up towers. And it's partly there is a kind of a sense that you've achieved more. You're looking from the castle back at the landscape, rather than kind of having a blinkered view curtailed by the parameters somebody else has set. But there's a risk as well, in that the risk is that this involves power, and this ability to view this vast landscape is probably more attractive, or becomes more important, or requires more focus and dedication, and possibly has a greater audience than the first-person view which you carry with yourself as a user of the landscape. Most of the plans were articulated in this way. There'd be example photographs showing the kind of pavement cafes we'd like to see, or the kind of pedestrian crossing we'd hope to see, or children playing, or those kind of things. But in reality, it was the plans from above, the satellite view, which was the thing which was probably going to set the rules in terms of what happened next. I was a bit disturbed by all this, because although it was impressive, and the people I was spending time with seemed incredibly competent, I was aware that not all the decisions were good. Sometimes it just happened that time ran out and there was money left over in the budget, and the Government Office South East or the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister said this money has to be spent within 3 months, and people ran around in corridors saying, have you got a project? Is something happening? And that project might possibly be realised. It might be a project which blights the possibility of a school having access to a housing estate, or it might be a project which enables a generation to get work. But the problem is that those analyses weren't possible to form at that point. It wasn't possible to actually step out of that perspective we had and stand in the landscape we were going to create and feel any confidence that we could critically assess the decisions we were making. It occurred to me that there's a hierarchy of knowledge, in that in so many fields it seems superior to have a larger remit, a kind of a more strategic view. If I'm a sales representative, a promotion would become the head of an office. A promotion might be to become a regional sales manager. A promotion might be to become nationally responsible for sales. And a promotion would be a global remit of some kind. But the question is whether it's actually kind of superior to see from above, or to see more. In some ways, I felt that the hierarchy was misplaced. And that while it was important to have that ability to focus on more than we can experience, and to try and comprehend how these individual elements fit together, there was a real problem in the assumption that that was better knowledge, or that knowledge superseded the human experience of being present within these macro systems. We all live our lives on multiple planes. I carry a phone, and so when I came here and got here from the bus, I used the GPS to navigate rather than my senses. I didn't have to use my memory of Dublin. I was looking at a map and trusting that that map was accurate, and allowing that to guide me and supersede my own understanding or my searching curiosity of the town. But actually, most of our experience is the first-person view. It's about how we feel in the place. It's our interaction with other individuals, and it's kind of like as much as we might be curtailed or compromised by the policy, the strategies, and the structural decisions, the actual experience is personal. So I started kind of deciding that was my work. I was going to try and make projects which challenge the hierarchy of this information in a very small way. Visual artists don't have massive audiences. We don't make Hollywood films. You have massive autonomy and a tiny audience. So you gain freedom, but you lose impact. But it is possible, because of that freedom, because nobody really cares if you're making your artwork or not, for you to actually focus on things which idiosyncratically you think are the most important things in the world. And hopefully everybody would have a different set of choices for that. For me, while working in Ashford and while working on public projects in Glasgow and in Birmingham, travelling around, there was time which was my own, which was lost time. I was driving a lot, carrying equipment, racing around the country, and the only thing that mattered was the moments when I arrived and the work I made on the ground. But I was losing part of my life to driving, and I was aware that was probably having an effect on my memories and my experience, my attitude, and other things. And I thought, rather than just pretend that wasn't happening, I should try and kind of focus on that. So while I was driving around the country, I decided I was going to make a film. And this film I set myself some rules, because I'm not a filmmaker. So the only thing I know how to do officially was painting, and that was the only thing I'm not allowing myself to do. So to avoid making some really naive decisions, I set some rules and decided to work to them. So I decided to take the central mirror out of the car, put my video camera there facing backwards, and I drive it exactly 70 miles an hour for thousands of miles, 2,000 miles, up and down to Glasgow and to Birmingham, and various other things that I had to do over a couple of weeks. And I would record everybody that tried to pass me on the road. I said that they would get in the film if they got close enough I could read the number plate, and they would last for as long as the interaction was in the film, and they'd all be credited by the number plates. And so over 4,000 miles, I recorded being tailgated by about 100 cars, and myself kind of annoying them and forming a rolling roadblock across Britain. It was a heroic, banal struggle. In my mind, I was involved in an absolute battle of wills with somebody in a BMW trying to persuade me in my little rust bucket of a car to get out of the way. It was outrageous that somebody in a Volvo 340 would stop a 7 Series BMW or a man in a white van, but somehow I decided that was my prerogative. So I was involved in this kind of tense, emotional, melodramatic struggle on the M1. But of course, visually, it wasn't really showing that. It was simply showing the banality of the M1. So I wrote to the Stravinsky Foundation, the people that had access to the rights for the Rite of Spring, and asked if I could use that theme, that soundtrack, to try and kind of reinstate what I felt was the personal experience over the visual evidence. So I'm going to show a quick clip of this. So it goes on. There's about an hour of that. It's a slightly painful thing looking back at it, because there's always the anxiety when you run out of petrol that you possibly were being met by somebody who'd been following you for 20 miles. But it was in a way, although it seems very flippant, what I was trying to do was suggest that there is resonance in all activity, regardless of whether it's something which is being prioritized or defined or described. It is part of the life, so that the experience of a city or the experience of of any aspect of our kind of organised world is something which is important, regardless of whether it's something which is being seen as valuable or something that was intended. My experience of master planning left me troubled, and so can I? What can I do? Minimize it? Is that? Yeah. Okay. So after successfully surviving my driving, I got out of the process of master planning, saw this document being published and going out there, and feeling unable to really verify whether any of these strategic interventions were going to cause more harm than good. I decided to try and get a bit of perspective. There was a possibility of going to China. There was an advert in the paper for an artist or artists interested in going to Shanghai or Beijing if they had a good enough reason for going. And I heard that Shanghai was the fastest growing city in the world at that point. They've just built more tower blocks on the west coast of America. And they'd paused because there was a suspicion that Shanghai is built on soft ground rather than the bedrock of New York. And there was a real possibility that maybe these things, they just needed to pause and assess whether it was all working or not. I went out there to try and understand how it was possible for people to make the leap of faith to look to increase the city by about 4 times its size. It was about 20 million people by the time I got there, but it's impossible to know for sure because there are a lot of people that were unofficial, coming from the countryside and not registered. But there was a plan for growth, and the plan was being written by somebody, and I wondered how any human being can possibly feel confident enough to plan for something that's incomprehensible for the rest of us. We can just about plan for our own lives, and we can plan for the people that we know and for the worlds that we feel that we have experience within. But to that level of abstraction, I thought maybe if I look at this extreme case, it will help me understand something about the much more moderate landscape that I've seen back home. So I got there, and I obviously found myself interested in traffic, and the private car ownership was a new thing. It had only been kind of made possible for people in a large scale to buy private cars and get licensed for it within the last 5 years or so. So these huge roads had been built, and people had moved from bicycles onto cars at quite a speed, which meant that people were still driving a little bit like they would have cycled previously, with the same kind of improvisational creativity that you'd have over road junctions, but using cars. And they had these people here, these traffic assistants, that were in charge of trying to make sure that this system worked. So with 12 lanes of traffic, you'd have individuals that would be spending 8 to 12 hours a day shouting at people. They had no power of arrest, they had a whistle, and they just scream at people to make sure they turned around and went the right way, and that people stopped running buses through red lights, and that mopeds weren't on the pavements and that kind of thing. At the end of their 12-hour shift, I'd meet them at the side of the road because I'd be filming them and we'd have a chat, and they seemed incredibly calm. And I just thought, that's bizarre, they should be absolutely kind of wired up. It was like they had some inner soundtrack which allowed them to keep this mental peace while dealing with the absolute impossibility of compensating for a plan that was possibly a little bit too fast. They were out there essentially keeping a city going, and somewhere there was a model and a plan which was causing these challenges to exist. The models and the plans were quite visible because they made buildings to hold the models and the plans. It was hard to find the person. Chongqing, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, the 4 growth areas of China, each of them built a vast museum to planning, where there was a massive model which covered the whole city, and people could go in there with their families and work out if their building existed in 5 years' time, and whether the road was going to come through the market and that kind of thing. The plan did change, and every so often architecture students would come in and swap a panel, and it would evolve. But essentially, because of all of the land being in government ownership, it was possible for somebody to write this plan and publish it without fear of necessarily this causing huge court cases. Essentially, the bombastic vision of changing a landscape for others was something which could be very confidently asserted. Normally, that's something which people are a little bit more cagey about, and even if they have that, they probably don't want everyone to know that they've already made a decision that's going to affect their lives without their consultation. But here it happened. And I met with some of the architects. I tried to find the 5-year planner. I wanted to know who he was. It took a while because everyone said there wasn't one. And eventually I found there was a professor who studied at Liverpool University, has a PhD there, and he'd become the 5-year planner for Shanghai. And They've made a master plan, printed 3,000 copies for a city of 20 million people, with the assumption not everyone was going to access it, and just quietly got on with it. And I met him and spent several hours talking with him about the possibility of social unrest and how this thing might work. And he was very philosophical about the whole thing. He said this 5-year plan is based on Paris, but the last one was Los Angeles. But nothing wrong with the last one, but we're just evolving as we go, you know. And there was a sense that essentially the whole landscape was an experimental laboratory. And it occurred to me there was incredible honesty about this, while also it being quite a dystopian vision. Spent time with architects who were being pushed to try and develop the housing for the million-person cities that were being created across China for the massive urbanization that was happening, not just in Shanghai, but also in places I'd never heard of across the country. And there were 35-year-old architects designing cities. There were people that there was so much pressure on them for time, there wasn't always time to design each of the buildings. So if they ran out of time and they had 10,000 more homes to design, there was a library of buildings which had already passed building regulations which they could download and add onto the plan to build up the density. And I got access to these models, and I started rapid prototyping them. There were 42 books of planning regulations in Shanghai officially, at least I think there were. And I spent time with architecture students, Chinese architecture students, foreign companies, and other people that were tasked with kind of building to these regulations. And we tried to design the highest density city that would legally pass. And we would only do things that were required of us. So there was nothing about primary schools, so we missed those out. But there was a lot about transport corridors, so we made sure there were very good roads. There was something about the amount of light that buildings would have in terms of the way they were orientated. And we worked on that. We looked at the way in which paths were formed and the connections made. And then we extrapolated it and made a modular city, which in theory would pass. I don't know if it would. When we showed this in Shanghai, planners came along and said, that's absolutely illegal. There's no way you could do that. But out of the window, we could see something that looked very similar. What was interesting about it wasn't just whether this is wrong or not, I don't know. But as it traveled around the world, it got bigger because it was modular. And eventually it ended up in Massachusetts. What was interesting about it for me was that it was beautiful. The model of this dystopian fantasy that hopefully nobody would ever build because it had no primary schools, no parks. It would be a toxic place with traffic assistants screaming continuously, trying to make it safe for you to cross the road. And actually, you could see that when the sun went down at all, most of the buildings were in shadow, at least for part of their time there. The strange thing was that even this model looked beautiful. It was made from dental plaster and it was theatrically lit and it hovered there in the middle of a huge room and there was a grandeur to it. And when you looked at it, you could almost be forgiven for thinking that that's plausible or maybe even kind of being seduced by it as you walk towards it. I think the thing that I was getting at, and this is a selection of projects dotted around over a 15-year period, and there are other ways that I attempted to articulate this, was that it is possible to fall in love with the model, with the plan, with the strategic vision, the clarity of the system, the way in which everything seems to make sense in abstraction, and the way in which we can formulate the chaos of our society with symmetry, maybe with cleanliness, maybe with order, even though at the back of our minds we know that we've never seen a world like that and there's no way that that could physically exist. Even if we know that if everything conformed to those principles and those rules, it would be a place that was profoundly alienating to ourselves, we can still find ourselves fetishizing the plan, the policy, or the map. So this is going to sound like the most extreme tangent, but the reason I'm dropping it in is because essentially reconciling myself with the thing which Dominic mentioned about being a war artist. Being a war artist isn't something you plan, and it's probably something which you should turn down. But for every war that Britain's been involved in since the Falklands, one artist has been nominated to go and document it. And they have an odd role in that they're uncensored. They're not there as a journalist. They don't have to have a media handler. And they're allowed, at least to some extent, to be accountable to the Imperial War Museum, in my case, the Wellcome Trust, and not to the army commander that's hosting them. So you're kind of hosted, but not embedded. I was longlisted without my consent or knowledge, and I got a phone call when I was in Holland saying that you might be interested in doing this, and I had to decide if I thought it was ethically justifiable or not. And it wasn't an easy decision because I'd actually been on the marches against both the Iraq and the Afghan invasion with my kids, and I certainly felt, in a way, as a profound pacifist in East London, that I probably wasn't the ideal candidate for it. But my family and I agreed that I would lose the ability to rail against the TV and watch Channel 4 News and kind of complain about the war on terror. If given a chance to test my own assumptions, I turned it down. So I went, and I spent a very short, immersive time surrounded by the novelty and the spectacle of war and some of the most ugly parts of it. I was attached to a field hospital, and I saw that the world which I'd understood from newspapers and from media absolutely appeared to become irrelevant as I got close to the actual activity which that was attempting to frame. Before I went, I'd read The Guardian, watched Channel 4 News religiously, and actually searched the internet a little bit and tried to read up on what was going on, what the intentions were, what the flaws were, what the historic precedents were, thinking I was reasonably well informed. And of course I got there, and I never saw the news while I was there. In fact, I never saw a newspaper that was more current than the day before I left, because the further forward you get, the longer it takes for newspapers to get to you. So when I left England, I was aware that Pakistan was in trouble. Martial law might be about to be declared. When I got to Kandahar, I was aware no longer about Pakistan, but I was mindful of Kabul. And we realized there was probably a bit of an issue because the milk supply was delayed because the convoys weren't getting through from the south. But we had a map which didn't include Pakistan anymore. It only included the areas that you could get to with British forces, which involved up to Kabul. When I went forward to Camp Bastion, the radius of interest there was only as far as you can fly with a helicopter and get back safely. So Kabul wasn't visible to me then, and Kandahar wasn't even really. That was just the escape route. And then when you get forward to Sangin, the map actually is the same size piece of paper laminated in plastic, and it's got the same amount of people sitting around it, and it takes the same amount of time to read it and to understand what's going on that day. It only covered as far as you could walk. So what was happening was that I was getting the same amount of information, but the focus was getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So instead of having a way to combine the strategic political narrative and test it against the activities that you experience as a human being in the middle, I was simply swapping one narrative for another. And this was something which I found kind of profoundly troubling. What you were seeing was essentially, I was taking off the wide-angle lens and putting on the standard lens, cropping the edge, and looking very closely at something in detail, but losing the ability to understand whether that had any logic in a wider narrative, or whether it jarred with that logic. What I was seeing was kind of random acts of violence and boredom, but without any attempt or understanding or any ability to reconcile those with any kind of meaning. And that was profoundly kind of upsetting. So while I thought I was supposed to be documenting war, what I realized that, of course, I didn't really know anything about war. I knew much less than anybody else that had been there, because I was there for a month and other people were there for 6 months, and some journalists have been there for years. I didn't really know anything about medicine, but what I did realize was that I was learning something about my complacency in terms of my understanding of mediated information and my acceptance of narratives which couldn't be contradicted easily. So if we assume that we've got Google Maps on here and we're not worried about it, we're not really being corrupted, because I'm still walking around Dublin, I'm still hearing the sound of traffic, and I'm still working out if I'm scared or not, or whether I feel at peace, and whether I feel it's a place which is comfortable, and whether it's interesting and architecturally significant. So I've got the map, but it hasn't completely destroyed my ability to trust my own senses. And in fact, if the map's wrong, and there is always the possibility the map's out of date, I can contradict it and be mindful of that, because I can test it with my own experience. But the problem is, it's the same format of the map that covers Afghanistan, and I can't go to Afghanistan very easily. So somehow it's possible, without the ability to step on the ground in Kabul and to see if this drawing actually represents the landscape, and to see whether the narrative in the Lonely Planet Guide or the narrative from Tony Blair is something which is real. What happens is, in the absence of ability to contradict it, I get lazy. And I start simply accepting it. Either accept that I disagree with it, or accept I agree with it, or accept that it's irrelevant to me. But it's different from the kind of intelligent complexity which we consistently apply to our own lives. And it is something which gradually happens through difficulty, just because one view becomes harder to reach than the other, or possibly it becomes through necessity, because our job is entirely about one form of narrative rather than the other. When I watched the planners building Ashford, and I saw other master planners in other parts of the country, I was aware that their experience, if they did drive in on the ring road, their human experience of that, which could be something which would critically inform their markings on the map about whether we should have a 6-lane highway racing around Ashford or not, was something which was resonant, but there wasn't an awful lot of space for it. They were required to be using the language of delivery, and in that case, the language of delivery was the macro perspective, not the micro. There's also something really interesting and very strange that I started to see, was that as people became more powerful and had the ability to affect more people's lives, their own constraints in terms of actually retaining the pluralism become greater. So if you become the Vice Chancellor of a university, it's much, much harder to go into a teaching room and find out if there's actually a kind of rewarding learning environment going on. If you're a subject leader or maybe even a dean of faculty, you probably still can do that to some extent, but you're gradually going to be using your personal experience of teaching 10 years earlier as the more visceral, kind of vivid memory of what it's like to actually stand in front of a class than the one that you're sporadically getting as a dean. Now, some deans and some vice chancellors manage to contradict that, but actually, you're being paid an awful lot of money. You're being told that your perspective, the one that is most important, the summation of your career, is to view the big picture, and it gradually becomes harder. Whether you're a general, whether you're a registrar of a university, whether you're a kind of a minister of state, or whether you're a vice chancellor, you're encountering something of the same problem, this problem of hierarchy of knowledge, and the fact that as you kind of progress up, if you have that opportunity, then you're told to embrace the wide area plan, embrace the map, embrace the strategic policy, embrace the thing which is going to affect many, many lives. There isn't room necessarily for you to say, actually, I don't feel confident. I need to step out of this bubble and stand back and look at myself. It might be because of risk, because a general can't go into the front line and walk around in case they get blown up by a mine. It's really embarrassing to lose a general. But, they'll probably be in a secure place off-site or maybe offshore even. It could be through laziness, it could be through fatigue, it could be simply that you're too expensive. You can't send the master planner to spend 2 or 3 weeks living in a housing estate because their daily rate is too high. But actually it might be really important. It might be more important than looking at the computer models of traffic. But we have this kind of rather strange kind of pressures and constraints which affect our ability sometimes to do that. So I went back, mindful of the fact that I had all of these kind of rather unfortunate memories and I had no way to contextualize them and no way to actually kind of put them to rest. Because if you've seen a car crash in Britain, you can probably go back to the point of where that happened. You can probably maybe even kind of read the press reports and learn something about why it happened. And either just through knowledge or even through kind of actually maybe doing something to help, you might be able to find some catharsis. It will never be easy, but it's possible. But if you see an act of violence in a war and you can't go back, and there's no way to really understand whether that was a crime against humanity or whether that was a heroic deed or whether somebody sacrificed themselves or somebody else for something noble, or actually whether history will look back and see that as something criminal, it's very hard to reconcile yourself to it. You might be able to forget or push it away, but you probably won't be able to really absorb it. So I went back in a rather kind of futile attempt to find context, and I travelled around north and I looked at a landscape which was much safer than Helmand, where people were attempting to rebuild, and some life was going on. And I was hosted by organisations, NGOs, that were trying to work in this way. So while the war was still present in a way, and it's certainly not your average environment, there were some acts of normality. The weird thing that for me was that they were trying to plan rebuilding a part of Kabul. And it was lots of people, including Rory Stewart over here, that you might recognise, that they'd been brought together to try and rebuild a historic district of Kabul. A very noble project in a way, kind of protect something of the heritage, make jobs for local people, make sure the skills are something which are protected and that kind of thing. But I was looking at this and I found it fascinating, but I spent my time in the south in a place where if you I met with the Minister of Health for Helmand, and their idea of any forward planning was probably to make sure that they had some money safe so they can make a fast escape. But you're not planning 10 years ahead or 20 years ahead, thinking about training people necessarily. You're thinking about, how do I survive the moment? And it seemed odd that people were planning. So an optimistic utopian thing in a way. But the thing that really worried me was this wall. Because what I saw here is something which actually is almost the same as you'd see in part of Bristol, or in Dublin, or in Glasgow, or in Birmingham. It's the way master planners and architects work, which is nothing wrong with it. They've got the stages, the REBA stages or other equivalents, and they're working through from site analysis through to delivery plan, and then people are going to be appointed to build those buildings and they're going to be realised. But while that might be a good system, the landscape in which I saw it last was somewhere so profoundly different from the landscape I was seeing it here that it seems to me shocking that you can actually use the same system for everything. So rather than simply changing the solution you're offering, you might want to actually kind of use this as an opportunity to question the system as a whole. And it seemed bizarre to me that under pressure of money being awarded by donor organisations, or simply the compelling need of the individuals to try and feel they'd left a mark and done something decent in the world, they were racing through with a form of analysis and a form of design and delivery and policy making, which essentially was so rigid and so embedded in the culture of the process that it left no room for people to question, maybe this is the wrong approach in Birmingham, but certainly it's something where in Kabul you have to think again and question every aspect of it and think, do we need to learn more before we work out how you make a decision? In the same way as in Ashford, I wasn't confident that in 30 years' time the whole thing wouldn't be as disastrous as the 1960s plan, which put the ring road around this historic core and separated the people from their houses, from their place of work. There's no way really I could feel absolutely sure that that decision making was flawless, and whether there were critical checks which allowed us to actually review and understand where we maybe have speculated too far and maybe where we need to kind of return. The idea, although everyone knew the master plan would never be finished as it was because governments change and people's ideas change, you still wrote what the outcome would be for 35 years' time. You didn't say, actually, okay, this is how we're going to start, and in 3 years' time we're going to review this and we're going to make sure that we leave ambiguous areas where we learn about where the local teenagers play and protect the waste grounds and make sure that those, if they are used for football, aren't simply assumed to be waste grounds. But instead, there's an attempt to try and show confidence. And I think in most of the professions where you get to that position, where you are the registrar, the consultant, where you are the general, the Minister of State, the teacher, in every aspect of our lives, whether it's simply being a parent or whether it's being a member of society, there is an aspiration for us to demonstrate that we believe in the system and that we have confidence in our judgment. And so while we may well still have our first person view and we have our memory of being a child and thinking, parents, why are they bossing me around? Why do I have to take this kind of form of arbitrary authority from my parents? Well, when we're parents, we have to do that. We have to become the arbitrary authority, because otherwise we have to really kind of, we break the system at our peril, because then we actually become an observer. We become an anthropological observer of our own existence as a parent, or we might be able to be involved with a form of duality where we're critically assessing our behaviour while also behaving. We have the pressure of delivering, so we have the pressure of making sure the class is taught, and we have the expectation that the surgery is performed, and we have the expectation that we write the policy and that the money is spent, and that we learn enough to get into our career, and that we raise the money to pay for a mortgage, which means that we don't always have the space to step out of that and say, is this construct wrong? Do I believe in the concept of property? Do I believe in this form of government? Do I believe that this hierarchy of knowledge is correct? Should the older surgeon be the person that's always listened to when technology has changed radically since they qualified? When keyhole surgery is the main surgery, do we listen to the person who trained doing open heart surgery rather than keyhole surgery just because they're senior? We have to respect knowledge and age and commitment, but it may be that we also need to have positions where we review the appropriateness of the knowledge or the systems we've got, rather than simply feeling compelled to demonstrate we have the knowledge. So my experience of Afghanistan, in a way, there were many things that happened, but one of the things that I came back from that really was that there is a requirement somehow within every field to not necessarily reconcile the macro and the first person experience, but there's a requirement to remain mindful of the fact that they probably contradict each other. And that the macro view, however elegant and however much it appears to sum up society and represent the trend dynamic of what we want to do as a group, whether it's a macro view for a family or for a class or for a group of friends or for a whole nation, we have to represent that that's a gross illusion, and that all it can do possibly is represent a container of the infinite pluralism of personal experience and ambitions and emotions and personal strifes and pleasures and joys within that community. And so while we might love the elegance, we might love the system, we might love our process, and we might love the outcome and that it delivers something, it's probably also necessary that we devote a more significant period of time to questioning whether that system is humble enough to allow for us to retain the empathy with our subjects, as well as actually kind of trying to design the world around them. This is an early master planning document from the 1960s for the North Peckham estate, where I did a piece of work. My piece of work was there, the North Peckham estate had already gone, essentially. In the 80s, there'd been an assumption that disadvantage by design was the thing. So that rather than thinking about the loss of industry and the failure to care about people being disenfranchised from work and not having access to new forms of employment, or maybe training not being good enough, or maybe simply the distribution of wealth was problematic, there was an assumption that probably it was the aerial walkways that was causing the crime on housing estates. So they broke the logic of this estate, trimmed off the aerial walkways, which were meant to allow people a car-free landscape 8 meters up all the way from Elephant and Castle to Alexandra Palace, where kids could play and milk floats could drive around, but there'd be no kind of diesel or petrol-driven cars. They tripped them off and left the towers on their own. And when I got there, the place was just a bizarre collection of architectural memories. There were fragments of several dreams that had happened. There was the Victorian tenements, which were demolished by the war and then kind of rebuilt. The remnants were finally demolished by utopian zeal to try and make some form of landscape that was suitable for a population. That failed officially and was demolished in parts and replaced gradually. When I was there, it was being replaced by a form of suburban housing which involved individual gardens rather than shared, because that's what people were assumed to want. And I met some local people. I met one guy who was a bit older, and he'd been involved in building the 1950s estate, and he'd been born in one of the Victorian tenements. And we walked around the area through the appalling traffic processes and the kind of like the terribly ugly bits of the back of buildings which still remained as they started this next phase of the project. And he said, "I love Peckham." And I said, "Really?" So, you know, it wasn't that my part of the world was very beautiful, but this was really ugly when I was seeing it, I thought. He said, "No, I absolutely love it." And I said, well, show me what you love then. You know, he's saying, well, over there, and he was pointing to a bit of mid-air, that's where I used to go to see my mate Bill or whatever it was, and we'd go to the pub over there, and we went to the health centre over there, and we'd pick up we'd pop around to see friends, we'd see kids, and he was pointing at bits of landscape that were pavement and bits of air that were now voids, that were at one point were aerial walkways, and parks which were now being built on. And it's because, in his mind, the memory of the landscape was more powerful in his life than the physical legacy that was left over. And of course, that's true for all of us. My experience on the motorway is very different from most other people, hopefully, on the M1. And my memory of passing through Leicester will always be tinged by the rites of spring and by the ridiculous melodrama I had. The place where people fall in love, or where they trip up, or where they realise that they've lost faith in something, is probably not marked by a monument, and it's probably not appearing on a plan. But the landscape, these things which are hard to measure, hard to articulate, are the things which probably define the quality of our lives and the engagement with whatever system is being defined by it. We're curtailed slightly by the quality of our language and our ability to represent human experience, and by the impossibility of representing pluralism and the infinite complexity and contradictions between all of our experience in this room and certainly any wider community. There's no way any form of language or representation can adequately do that. But possibly what we can do is flag up the anomalies, and every so often, at the same time as trying to provide a more beautiful system, a better policy, a better approach to society, is to flag up and give huge amounts of effort to show how the subjective experience may feel or may be represented idiosyncratically by individuals within that. You can't show all, but if you show any of them with as much commitment as you might show the macro plan. What you're showing and reminding people is that the macro plan can't represent it. What you're doing is you're reminding people that actually at ground level there will be things which should be there and remembered to be a contradiction to the plan. Essentially what I'm saying is that it's important within architecture, within art, within policy making, within healthcare, is to have space for people to flag up the individual human experience not as being representative of others, but just reminding us that it probably isn't being represented in the narrative. The little video clip which you saw at the beginning was based on 5 years of conversations with a trauma surgeon who worked in Soweto. The most extraordinary person, he's I can mention his name, is Roger Kneebone. He was a Wellcome Engagement Fellow. And if anybody's met him, they'll know that he's got a disarming kind of giggle when he talks. And he's got this kind of profound understanding of the complexity of healthcare in places as troubled as that. And we talked about a whole range of things, not necessarily his experience, but things that we've realised in terms of our crises of faith and belief in the systems we're in and our inability to prove whether things were necessarily the best processes or the best decisions at the time. And we talked particularly in terms of doctors, how the surgeon in the room, it was absolutely inappropriate for the surgeon to show fear, weakness, or any kind of self-critical kind of awareness of their ability to fail. Because everybody was relying, including the patient, of course, on their ability to hold up a system which probably all of us had our doubts about. It's not that the system is wrong necessarily, it's just that the system has risks. It's not that the doctor should be saying, I can't do this, but it's saying that nobody can guarantee they can do this. And rather than the doctor saying, actually, I'm feeling too scared at this moment to do this, I'm not sure if my knowledge is up to date, I don't know if actually this is the wrong decision. The doctor, once that decision is made, is required to demonstrate confidence and to embolden you to go with them, whether you're the scrub nurse or whether you're the patient. It was just one of those examples, I suppose, of a context where there might be a parallel narrative. In this, we wrote, Rwanthi Chikere and myself, as a screenwriter, we worked together and we developed 20 short narratives which showed a transition from hierarchy where the doctor was in control through to the point where the patient had undermined the doctor, to the point where there was some sense of communal solidarity and a reconciliation that nobody really had control of the narrative. They're rather spoofy in a way, and some of them are kind of a little bit more poignant. But it was really, the important thing was that the parts could be read by either side. The person, the character that you decided was the actor, the patient could also read the doctor's parts, and the other way around. It just depended on the persona as to which one you believed was in charge. And it was played by the same actor, and it was designed in a way to talk about the unspoken anxiety, which we probably suppress in order to maintain the illusion of the role that we need to publicly show. In this case, the doctor is the patient, the doctor is ill, and sometimes the doctor will be the patient, and sometimes the doctor will be performing surgery in this kind of conceit. But as a doctor, like all doctors, there is the possible fear of failure of performance, or possibly that you're about to be superseded, as we all get scared that our knowledge is going to become redundant, as well as the great bravado needed and to show the courage which brings other people with them. As the patient, in this case, the patient becomes the person who is kind of has reconciled themselves to their fate, become philosophical about it, and that ends up emboldening the doctor. Of course, it's the same person. It just depends on which view you're looking at. So I will finish with a moment of reconciliation.
Define swan song. Farewell, curtain, finale, leave-taking, valediction. You looked it up, of course. And your preference from the above. It's all morbid. I think it's all fantastically grand. Well, it would be grander if it goes wrong, true. Tragedy is terribly compelling. They don't call it a theatre for nothing. Well, maybe then that's the way to go. With a splash. Make sure they don't forget you. Make them talk about you. Study you forever. You know, I miss this. Is that what this is about? What do you mean? Have you grown into one of those horrors that can't let go? Who do anything to come back, to be back? Do anything to be remembered, even if it is for a mistake. What kind of doctor are you? Well, that was my next question. So what? What kind of doctor are you? A good one, I hope. At least I have a reputation for being a good old doctor, which is better than being an old man, which is what you become after you finish being an old doctor. A wise doctor. Okay? A wise doctor. Which is an old word, and it is a word that only the old would use. What else? What kind of doctor are you? Today? An ill doctor? I was hoping you would say that. Is that an oxymoron? An ill doctor? It's a well-kept secret. They'll come for you soon. The grand escort. They still do that. Splendid, isn't it? The build-up is phenomenal. So, you ready then? No. Ask me a difficult question. Do you think this operation is a mistake? Can't you do a slightly easier one? Do you think this operation is a mistake? There is someone at the door, isn't there always? Ready then? As ready as I have always ever been.
Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, David. We can take questions. We have a bit of time to do that if you want. If you want for a question, please could you use the mic, and that way around we keep the recording. And if you don't, I'll make one up. I'll make one up. It's a lot of information. That's the first thing. It's one of the interesting things I think with these is as a individual creative practitioner, you're kind of given a passport to go and ask questions without a brief. So whereas in most other in this group of people who have mixed methodologies, quite often you have to earn your passport by studying everything in a precise area. But as a creative practitioner, you get to ask questions across. But do you also find that you become dated?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the great advantage of making artworks is most people think that they're peripheral and not that important. So you can be underqualified and not necessarily put someone's life at risk, you know. And so if you've got a war artist that doesn't know what they're doing, it's not nearly as bad as having a military surgeon who doesn't know what they're doing. So you can be somebody who is really kind of wrestling with trying to work out what knowledge is needed, and also possibly be out of your element to the point where you have to critically review what is the appropriate methodology rather than having one that you've been trained to use. So I think every one of these interventions, there were many more that I deleted before people came in, we're trying to work out what is an appropriate timeline or narrative to pull together from these eccentric interventions. Every one of them is profoundly dated now. They were moments when it felt necessary and appropriate to try and make that reflection on the world I live in. And it's a very narrow perspective, and I'm not claiming that in a way that all of these things have a timeless resonance or even a resonance beyond myself, but I think it's important that as many of us as possible kind of provide an alternative narrative to the one which is being recorded as the dominant one. So, I mean, with a bit of luck, by the time my daughter is, you know, kind of old enough to have a car, there won't be any petrol cars And certainly there won't be a culture of the kind of aggressive macho driving which I grew up with in East London, which would mean that that would be absolutely incomprehensible. Why would anyone, why would tailgating be a thing worth focusing on? But at that moment, I think it was historically significant, and it probably wasn't a thing we'd boast about, and for me it felt like it was relevant. So I think the important thing is not necessarily to be an expert, but to know the limits of your reach and make sure that everything is framed with a clear acknowledgement of the parameters of what you're claiming to say.
And I suppose the thing to add in onto that is when we think, in the Global Brain Health Institute, we look at two things. We look at equity and we look at brain health, and we look at them through particular lenses at a particular time. So it's always interesting when you get into, it's why we do this, it's why we set up this series of talks, is to sort of how do we sit outside of our own expertise so we don't become a closed loop, and then how do we cross over the challenge of communicating across areas where people have very specialized knowledge with a particular language within a particular hierarchy of knowledge and all sorts of hierarchies. So thank you for this. Anybody else want to add in anything? Go, Chris.
It's more of a response, David, than necessarily questions. And you mentioned Rwanthi there at the end, and it just struck me that it's interesting when you talk about being an artist called into the big planning, how Rwanthi's been called into the government in Sri Lanka in terms of the first ever national cultural policy, that she's been invited in precisely because she's an artist and one who's been there. Who knows at what point it gets sucked in and transforms into being incorporated into the mud. But just an interesting parallel, and I'd forgotten that I knew the two of you working together in that sort of way. So just a couple of responses. And in a way you said, midway through, there was a technical glitch where you're saying, is this the reflection? I think that was the word you said, or is this the mirror? And sometimes people's reflections are a mirror. So how I heard some of the things that you were saying. So when you showed the picture of all the little buildings, and you said, but no one could really build it, what I saw was a hairbrush. And when you talked about the fisheye, and you said when you lose your fisheye, when you have to go back to a normal lens, that there's an absence of the wide. And every day when I come into work here at Trinity, 10 minutes of my journey on the train, because I abandoned cars in order to just pass time, because another time you said, I'm just passing time. I'm thinking, for me as an artist, in the passing of time, things can occur. And what I heard you describe was in the passing, to get rid of the passing of time, you created a structured drama. You actually defined, like sort of psychogeography, you defined what was going to measure and make manageable and structured what would otherwise be passing time. Whereas to me, it might be the way the sun glanced off this, or that thing there, or et cetera, et cetera. And part of my journey every day is going past Sandymount Strand, which is an area of Dublin Bay where the tide goes so far out. And I take a photograph on my phone every day. But what I then do is zoom in and crop it so it looks like an abstract painting. And I know it's Sandymount Strand and the wall and the beach and the sea and Howth. But every day it's a different painting. So I just thought it was very interesting of that within, like nanotechnology, that actually within the small is also the large, and sort of how we're experiencing it. That then quickly linked to when you were talking about the overview and the satellite picture, remembering years ago when I did my first teaching philosophy statement and trying to describe, because they're all new then, how do I describe what it is? And the way I managed to describe it was that I'm an eagle flying above it all and seeing what's there, getting manageable bite-sized bits which I will digest to feed you, and I'm also the road sweeper, clearing, and not the bus driver, the road sweeper, clearing the road so that you won't trip over some of the little stuff as you go on there. And it was absolutely the combination of that, the particular of moving something off the road, sweeping, not even linked into that. And then mentioning words like career, or if you want to move up, and I'm thinking, well, no, I've never wanted a career. I'm a head of a department in Trinity College, and it would be impossible for someone with my background to have this job now, because in fact the standing back and reflecting on your own practice has become so much, not just the reflective practitioner, but the scholar practitioner who does just what was being talked about there, of studying everything in the field. And so everyone these days has a PhD, or you don't get in the door. The first requirement of the job is to have a doctorate, not, as was in my case, to be a practitioner in the field that's being studied. Do you see what I mean? So I just think it's interesting how even our language becomes structured, and sort of how long can you stay in something and be fiddle in the edges and have the chance to make a quantum difference, and then realise that actually the sands will at some point cover over, but there'll be a bit more space there. And then, sorry to take, the very last thing I wanted to say was about Ireland. Because when you talk about putting individual narrative, the individual story into the narratives, that is absolutely what is happening here in major ways, in terms of, if you think about like Rwanthi and the cultural policy in Sri Lanka, that here the importance in relation at the moment, this very moment, in terms of sexual harassment, gender equality, etc., the Me Too movement that started elsewhere in the macro and is actually being picked up in the micro, and where the constitution has been changed at the moment. There's another bid going through, and the emphasis is on personal story. The emphasis is not on, let's look at the statistics. The emphasis is on, tell the personal story, because that empathy, it's like get to know your oppressor or get to understand them, you know, your kidnapper or whatever. And it happened here with the Marriage Equality Act, where it was the literally part of the campaign was go home and talk to your granny. Because it's not just about where is the new and where are the young doctors who know about keyhole surgery, but it was also how do you talk to the people who only trust doctors who know about knives. Because it's in that general sharing of stories and, if you like, education on that individual basis, which has a structural understanding, a systemic understanding of change built into it, and that's how change is happening here. And I think maybe, you know, your examples were from the UK, and maybe it is that this is a small enough country for that those sort of complementary spheres of influence still to work. But you look at Middle America, you look at Brexit Britain, and the talk about the people who no one went home and talked to them. You know, and it's not just the grannies, the people whose lives are within a system that hasn't necessarily experienced some of those traits. At which point I'm straying beyond my own evangelicalism. But I just think that it would be interesting maybe for you to actually, the way things are happening here is very, very much the individual story, and told not to just to the peer group or the generation. So as I say, it's a response rather than a question.
No, it's great. You said all things that I should have said and didn't quite manage to articulate. But just to say that I'm aware there are many progressive examples of contradictions to that rather bleak narrative that I gave. But I think it's just that the thing you mentioned about the eagle and the road sweeper thing. The key thing about that is you acknowledge the subjectivity of the eagle perspective. And I think while we critique our politicians and other people, there are many fields where we forget to remind ourselves that there are subjective decisions being made, even on the macro perspective, in terms of what makes it onto the map. You know, what is the data set? How's it edited? Where are the parameters? And actually, although there are many profoundly interesting contradictions to that, I still think that there is sometimes a complacency which comes into our acceptance of these incomprehensible perspectives that you know is the opposite to what you were displaying when you described it. And the other thing I'll just mention is the thing about Rwanti's working with the cultural policy desk, and all the work I work with when I work with master planners, I think both acutely aware that it'd be very easy to simply become the thing you're observing. And you know, there are many great master planners and architects out there, luckily, and the last thing they need is an artist pretending to be one. And same with, you know, there are many war journalists and there are many soldiers, you know, but you lose your value if you lose the critical space that you have. You know, and I think in some roles, the priority is to become close enough so that you're not naive and not making terrible superficial judgments, but somehow have a space to step out so that you can also retain some independence of view. And if you become too familiar with it, it may be that that's the time to walk away from that particular context and allow other people with a fresh set of eyes to come in. Once I learned all the acronyms involved in government offices and planning, I kind of felt I was institutionalized, and I probably lost the the wide-eyed kind of naivety, which allowed me to ask, well, why are we doing this? You know, once you accept that that's the normal way of doing it, then you stop asking why we've chosen that normal. And possibly you need to have another generation of people coming in to challenge those contexts. I think it's just the trick is to always invite in perspectives that are not familiar with the conventions that you've achieved, so that you're always reminded these are conventions rather than, you know, some form of inherent truth.
So I nearly bring it to a close, unless there's anybody with questions that have joined us online. Nope. Okay. So many of the things that David talked about are present in the people that will be presenting on the 2nd and 3rd of March, but they come at it from very different types of fields. So when Brian Lawler talks about national strategies for Alzheimer's and dementia, or the positive aging strategy in Ireland, or Healthy Ireland, he will also be talking about how you preserve hope through the creation of a national strategy. When the first group on the first day talk about the social determinants of brain health and impacts upon individuals, they'll also be talking about how the buildings that we create and why those buildings are created at a specific historical time have health effects over the long term. And as we go on, people will be talking about the development of cultural policy, which is pretty much indivisible from the development of a well-being health policy. And so these talks are really about marking out this territory that is appearing, that we have as part of the Global Brain Health Institute, which is about how do we address big, complex challenges of illness, disease, within systems that are really an understanding which is perhaps lagging behind the lived experience in all sorts of different countries and context. So I hope you can join us there. But for today, David Cotterrell, thank you very much.